Hello, this is me at Nakhavali, and you're watching and listening to the Middle East Analitika. On this episode, we speak about the political situation in Libya. I speak with Tarek Megerisi, Senior Policy Fellow at the Middle East and North Africa team of the European Council on Foreign Affairs. Tarek, thank you very much for joining the program.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure.
More than a decade is passed already, and people continue to debate whether military intervention was necessary and the best course of action in Libya. Some people still have this opinion that the West just intervened in order to protect its future interest in Libya's natural resources. What is your opinion about the intervention in Libya?
You start me off on an easy question, huh? It's look, I understand people's opinions or the narratives and the stories that came out from Libya because the intervention came within the context of a broader war on terror in the region. And personally, I feel like the narrative that's been constructed around the intervention is colored a lot by the failures of what happened after the intervention. Some lazy analysis by certain groups who, they consider Libya and Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria to all be the same thing. They don't respect the different contexts and the different stories. But then also, I think that there was a fundamental point of the right to protect, which was the principle that was invoked at the UN to justify the intervention. And I think this was a great idea. It's a great principle, but the attacks to the Libyan intervention is used to damage that principle in international standing and to ensure that it can never be invoked again. So personally, I think that the intervention was a necessity. It was something which saved a lot of lives and it saved a lot of destruction in the long run. So by the time the intervention came in March 2011, Libya was already past the point of no return, so to speak. This wasn't an intervention like in Iraq, where the Americans decided they're going to do regime change. Here, the Libyan people decided that they had had enough of Gaddafi. They saw an opportunity to kind of get rid of the system which had oppressed them for so long, and they tried to take it. And Muammar Gaddafi, he responded how he always responded. He responded with violence, and he kept threatening greater and greater violence. So, the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, he likes to always make a joke, and he says, Syria, at least we're not Libya. But I think that this is a great comparison. So if there was no intervention, then Libya would have looked a lot like Syria. I mean, you can forget the failure of the transition because I think it's a different topic. But in Libya, the intervention finished the revolution against Gaddafi in what? Just over six months, maybe, from March to October 2011. There was minimal damage outside of a few notable exceptions like the city of Sirte. And then look at Syria, where there wasn't an intervention. There, the war stretched on for years. A huge amount of the population fled and still live away as refugees. All the major population centers outside of the capital are destroyed and in ruins. That was a horrible war. And that's what Libya would have looked like if it wasn't for the assistance of NATO to the revolutionary actors. But if you want to talk about the transition and the failures there, then that's a different story. But the intervention itself, I think, was a necessity and a blessing to the Libyan people.
Right. I frequently hear this sentence from Libyans while discussing the present and prior political regime. And the sentence is, I hate to say it, but our life was better under the previous regime. So, is that so? And also, I want to ask you, in your opinion, what's the legacy of Muammar Gaddafi for Libya?
There's a Libyan author called Hisham Matar, and I think he summed this up perfectly when he said Libyans today are swimming in the ashes and they're yearning for the fire. I mean, when you look at the legacy of Muammar Gaddafi, this is the legacy of Gaddafi. I mean, forget the immediate notion, which is that his people hated him so much that they rose up against him. They risked their lives. Some of them paid with their lives to get rid of him. But the problems that Libya has today, every kind of fracture or line of conflict and collapse that Libya is suffering from today, if you trace them back, they start from Muammar Gaddafi's rule. And he ruled for 42 years. So, he defined the lives of a couple of generations of Libyans. He was able to reshape the society, to reshape the political culture. And let's go back to see, how this affects today. So today, Libyans are divided. Communities are fighting each other. Neighbors are fighting each other. There's a lack of trust and a lack of cooperation between the different regions. All of this comes from Gaddafi's own policy of kind of pitting communities off each other in a divide and conquer type of strategy. One of the biggest problems after the revolution was that there was no state to pick up the pieces and to govern. And that's because Muhammad liked to rule through chaos so that his people wouldn't know what to expect or what to anticipate. So there was no institutional framework to pick up the country and to be able to govern the country. And then you have these kind of platforms of corruption or these systems of state corruption. I mean, the way Gaddafi constructed the state and constructed the economy of the state, it didn't just incentivize corruption, it almost forced corruption. And this mentality and these systems are still alive today. I mean, even all of the political leadership of Libya today all have kind of roots in Gaddafi's system, and today they are perfecting and they are taking to the furthest degree possible the corruption that was enabled by him. So all of those in charge today, from the warlord to the politicians, are, you could say, the disciples of Gaddafi. So I really would strongly argue that even if there was no revolution, if there was no war, and Gaddafi died peacefully in his sleep one night, that the country would still look exactly the same today as it did back in as it does now because of the war.
Right. You mentioned today Libya is a country with a complex political landscape characterized by various factions and groups with divergent interests and goals. Could you please tell us what are the main political factions and groups in Libya and what are their goals?
Libya is a funny country or a different conflict in the sense that you don't really have strong ideological groups or political parties or factions with broad constituencies. I mean, I'll go through the main political actors in a second, but it's important to note that none of these people have a strong popular base. Some of them try to appeal to particular values or particular ambitions for a more stable country or a more secure country. But really, all of them rule by force of arms or the ability to provide corruption through these kind of patronage networks that were set up in Gaddafi's time, or because of the legal authority or the position that they inhabit. Not a single one of them has a popular legitimacy to be in their position. In fact, the Libyan people are desperate to get rid of them. And this is very different to pretty much any other country. But saying that, you do have those with positions of legal or military authority who have splintered the country up between them. And you can break these down to particular groups. So you have the government, which is stationed in the capital of Tripoli. This government was appointed almost 2 years ago now as part of a UN process designed to lead Libya to elections in the aftermath of a civil war. Obviously, these elections have not happened. I think you could strongly argue that the government has no interest in making them happen and instead wishes to remain in power and to profit from its position as kind of holding the keys to the gate of the Libyan treasury. So they are offering a lot of international contracts. They are trying to position themselves as the force that can return Libya to being a regular state or a normal state. And they're doing that through offering cash, for want of a better term. But their authority within Tripoli is limited by a bargain that they create with local militias. The fact that the prime minister comes from another nearby city called Misrata means that they have some support from that city as well. But really, they do not have much legal authority beyond that. So they don't have much de facto authority beyond that. So, if you go to the rest of the country, oftentimes when the prime minister would like to send a minister to the south, for example, they are blocked from landing. So their authority doesn't extend very far. Opposing them politically are the two houses of parliament that Libya has. And this is organized into kind of a lower chamber and an upper chamber as part of a political agreement formed in 2015. Sorry. So this parliament sits in the far east of the country, in the city of Tobruk, and the reason why is a long story in and of itself. But because they are based in the far east of the country, they have become a political face for military groups and international actors who are opposed to the government in Tripoli and who would like to displace and to replace the government in Tripoli. So this parliament doesn't actually pass many laws. It doesn't actually work much like a normal parliament, but they are often kind of a thorn in the government side and trying to find legal ways to exert pressure and authority over them, be this through appointing judges or even appointing a whole new government. And the force behind the scenes in eastern Libya, which we should mention, is the armed forces of an old general called Khalifa Haftar. Now, Haftar was a general from Gaddafi's era who, to cut a very long story short, fled and lived in Virginia in the United States for a long time afterwards. He returned after the revolution, and he kind of set upon this path with a lot of foreign backing to try to almost become a new military dictator. And he rose from 2015 until perhaps his pinnacle in 2019 when he declared or when he attacked the capital city of Tripoli to try and take it over. He lost that war catastrophically, and his broader alliance crumbled. However, due to the lack of any real opposition force to the government after this, he still remains kind of propped up by various international actors and by some Libyan groups in eastern Libya who, he's more useful to have there than to not have there for them.
Right.
So him and his sons, they kind of run the informal economy of the region, and they almost act like a mafia now.
Right, right. Now let's talk about the involvement of external powers in Libya. We know that this involvement has often complicated efforts to find a lasting political solution to the country's problem, as different actors, of course, pursue their own interests and priorities. So, what are the main external players involved in the Libyan conflict, and what role do they play in shaping the political situation in Libya?
I don't think we have enough time to talk about all the international actors who are involved in Libya. And look, I understand this country, which doesn't get talked about much, can become very complex and very difficult to understand when you look at all the actors involved. But I spoke last time about saying that the Libyan leadership and the Libyan actors, they don't have much of a popular constituency. So how they hold their power is largely by international recognition. So either they are just considered a legitimate legal authority by Western actors or groups like the UN, and so they are able to claim, look, I'm a prime minister, I have authority and legitimacy not from my people, but from international recognition. And then you have those who are almost like proxies for their international backers. And Haftar is a great example of this because at the same time, Haftar can be dependent on countries like the United Arab Emirates or Egypt to provide him military backing. But it doesn't mean he listens to everything that they say. It's almost like a mutual dependency that they have with each other. These countries need Haftar to be their vehicle to challenge the government, and Haftar needs them for the military support, but they both keep trying to get a hand up on each other. And there's this principle of what do they call it? The sunk cost fallacy, which I think underscores a lot of the international involvement in Libya, whereby they say that they have already invested so much in these proxies that even though they are not returning, these countries feel like it's too late to kind of back off and to pick someone new. They just have to keep supporting them. So I mentioned lightly the main players on Haftar's side already. You have the United Arab Emirates, which has been involved in Libya since 2011. And, whilst we will talk of the NATO intervention that happened there, we don't talk much about the special forces operations and the troops on the ground that were provided by the United Arab Emirates and by Qatar on different sides of the revolution to help push it along. And the fact that these countries worked on different sides from day one laid a lot of the groundwork for the splits in Libya and the factionalization that happened afterwards. Then you have Egypt, which I think tells a story to the world that they are involved because they have this long desert border, and then Libya is an issue of national security for them. But I think if you look at their actions and their activities, it's really much more of a paternalistic involvement. Egypt sees Libya as almost like a client state that they would like to control, that they would like to benefit from economically. And so they keep trying to manipulate the political process in their favor to give them that control. And they keep failing to do so, which causes a lot of damage. And then you have the two big players who kind of came in during this war I mentioned on Tripoli that Haftar started in 2019. So Haftar initially was not successful. He was trying for 7, 8 months to break into the city. And despite all the weaponry that the UAE provided him, he wasn't able. So he got this organization called the Wagner Group, which is essentially a de facto arm of the Russian state, a mercenary group to come onto the front lines. And they provided a much more effective fighting force for him. The government in Tripoli started to panic and they signed a deal with Turkey to come in and to defend them. And so Turkey won that war for the Libyan government. It was Turkish drones, it was Turkish military effectiveness and efficiency, an organization which allowed them to push back and to destroy Haftar's forces. And since then, the Turks have a heavy military presence on the ground in the form of trainers, but they also have, good real estate on naval bases in Misrata and airfield. And the Russians retreated to almost draw a line down the country in central Libya. So the Russians operate 2 or 3 air bases across the country, mostly down that central line, as well as a naval base in Sirte. And they kind of maintain a balance of power between them, with Russia in the east and Turkey in the west. That's the basics of it, but there are a lot more countries involved.
Okay, now let's move toward civil society in Libya. We know that while in 2011 Constitutional Declaration of Libya allows the freedom to establish political parties, groups, and civil society organizations, but we know also that these organizations are strictly under the control of government and supervision of security forces. Given these circumstances, how effective is civil society in influencing the political environment in Libya?
I think that they are less and less effective for this reason that you mentioned. I think in the early days after the revolution, like in other countries like Tunisia and so on, there was an explosion in civil society organizations because people were excited and enthusiastic to be able to help. They weren't very professional. They suffered from a lot of problems because it was something that was new to them, but they were developing slowly. But over the last few years, since about 2017 in Eastern Libya, since about 2020, 2021 in Western Libya, the security forces have really been clamping down on them. It becomes a lot more dangerous to engage with the international community, to try to do any politically aligned civil society work. So, if you're helping to deliver services at a municipal level, the security organizations don't really care. But if it's anything that affects politics, then all of a sudden you draw their interest. And we've seen over the last couple of years civil society activists being arrested, intimidated, dragged on front of TV screens to admit that they were, trying to destroy the religion of the state and, all of these ridiculous moral crimes which they accused them of. And it's a very simple intimidatory tactic. In fact, it's something that was employed a lot during the Gaddafi era. And we can really see this as part of the rise of Gaddafi's old security services back in the new Libyan structures. So, all of these intelligence agencies and secret police and so on are being rehabilitated in the current security structures. And these are the lessons that they have for the new Libyan authorities, basically saying you have to control the narrative to the outside world and you have to control the communities within Libya itself. And so, yes, unfortunately, civil society, as ambitious as they are, as enthusiastic as they are, as helpful as they can be, are now being suffocated in Libya. And alarmingly or unsurprisingly, depending on how you look at it, they don't get any support from these Western states, which rely on them so heavily for their own development programming work.
Right. Libya is a home to diverse range of ethnic groups and tribes, each with its own identity and history. We know that this diversity has historically been a source of strength for the country, but in recent years it has also contributed to division and tensions. How tribalism contributed to the problem in Libya, in your opinion?
Libya today is a very atomized country, they would call it. Everything is broken down into its smallest social parts. And this is largely because of the stress that people live under ever since 2011. When you're going through hard times where you have to compete for resources, where you have conflict around you, where you have political competition for development and things like that, then that causes a regression in society. So you could argue that perhaps before tribes or local communities weren't that big a deal, whereas now they became a much bigger deal for people, because the only way you get social protection and you can access your rights is through the larger strength that is given to you when you fall back and join your community, your tribe, your family, your ethnic group, depending on which part of the country you are in. And so really this is the case across the whole country now. In eastern and southern Libya, tribes are much more important than in western Libya, which is more metropolitan and more cosmopolitan as a result. But even there, you have fights between neighborhoods in the city or between cities themselves, such as famously between the cities of Misrata and Zintan, which shows you that it's the same basic problem at a root level. But in my opinion, this is not the flaw of tribes. If tribes didn't exist, there would be some other construct that people fall back on. It's the flaw of insecurity. Where people feel like they have to compete against their common citizen to access basic rights, then they will always find some kind of grouping to leverage to their advantage. But really, Libya must remake its social contract to find a way to be able to describe Libyans as citizens, whereby you're equal no matter which group you come from, rather than by giving people privileged positions depending on which tribe or which community or which city they come from, which again is a legacy of the Gaddafi era. And this was how he used to rule, whereby he would take a small community from a big area and say, you guys are the ones in charge. You get to decide who gets development aid, who gets government jobs, and so on. And this creates rivalries and competitions between the different groups. And it's something that we're still living with today.
Right. Let's also talk about very important issue, especially for the international community, and it is migration and refugee crisis. We know that Libya has been a major transit point for migrants and refugees from Africa and the Middle East region who are seeking to reach Europe. Um, what are some of the key factors contributing to the migration crisis in Libya, and how can the international community support efforts to address the challenges faced by migrants and refugees in this country?
Well, as you said in the question itself, Libya is a natural kind of departure point for African refugees and migrants who would like to get to Europe, because at its closest point, it's quite close to Italy. You also have another problem whereby, pre 2011, where Libya's economy was more functional, Libya used to depend on a lot of African migration to do basic labor work in the country, which Libyans didn't like to do. So in better times, Libya used to actually absorb a lot of migrants itself. And so many of the migrants in the country would come to Libya for work rather than come to Libya to wish to go to Europe. But again, due to the instability in the country over 10 years now, which is, aggravated issues like racism and general insecurity, now they're all hoping to go on. And it's been well documented how barbaric and how I can't even think of the words for it. Just how inhumane the refugee trail has become, and I call them refugees instead of migrants because a few of them are economic migrants posing as refugees, but most of these people are fleeing destitution, are fleeing war, are fleeing political persecution, and so it's better to call them all as refugees rather than as migrants, which is a policy play by Europeans and by others to try to make them seem as if they're not refugees and they are a group that can be discriminated against. I mean, since 2015, 2014, when the crisis started, whereby you had hundreds of thousands crossing the Mediterranean, These guys have been put into detention centers, and this is all well documented by various human rights groups and migrant groups, whereby they're packed into cells. They don't have clean water or regular food. There's a lot of disease that goes around. Some of them are sexually assaulted. Others are forced into labor, or they're tortured on video to their families back home so that they can send more money for a crossing over the sea. So they're extorted for that crossing. And the European response, led by the Italians, 2016, 2017, and it was named after the then Interior Minister, Marco Minniti, is basically to pay these Libyan militias, to give them money to keep migrants and refugees in these camps and in these detention centers without any demand or requirement to actually improve their habitat, and instead of allowing them to cross the sea, and then working with another Libyan militia, which called itself a coast guard, in order to ensure that these migrants can't escape. And it's been documented by the UN's own panel of experts reports, and you can see it in 2017 and 2018, that this instigated a shift in the economy of northwestern Libya, whereby suddenly migrants became big business, catching migrants became big business. So even kind of Africans or Bangladeshis and so on who used to come to Libya to work, all of a sudden found themselves rounded up and pushed into these camps. Um, there's a story of two Bangladeshis even who arrived in Libya for work. They had work visas. They were put into a camp. They were extorted for money and sent to Italy. And only in Italy did they say, we didn't even want to come to Italy. We wanted to go to Libya, but this is what happened to us. And this shows you the failure of the policy to date. And I'm being quite harsh and direct in talking about it, because now that the migration problem is getting worse in Libya again, and more migrants are coming from eastern Libya now, mainly from Egypt and Sudan. And from Sudan, it will get worse because of the war over there. The response in Europe is to try to do effectively the same thing, except for two problems. One, they cannot afford to do the same thing, to give that amount of money, because people smuggling is a big business. And secondly, there is no equivalent of a singular militia or group that they can pay off, as there was in Western Libya. So now is really the moment for Europeans to put in place a real policy with all of these different countries. Libya is a transit point; it's not a launch point. Trying to stop migration in Libya is like trying to, put a dam in a river at the end of the river. There's no point. It's already done by that point. So yeah, we can go into migration policy more if you want, but you know, in Europe, migration is not a policy problem; it's a political problem. So it's a much bigger um, issue than just Libya itself.
Tarek, thank you very much, and it was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much. The pleasure was all mine.
Thank you very much for watching and listening to us. Please don't forget to subscribe.